First off, David, congratulations. The highest calling. You have to read it. It's an incredible walk through what the presidency is right up to today, including ending with interviews of Joe Biden and Donald Trump. But I wanted to begin, David, with, you mentioned in the book when Woodrow Wilson goes across the Atlantic for the Treaty of Versailles, and Europe treats him after World War I as a celebrity, you know, the quiet former New Jersey governor, Princeton president, now is this global superstar. Reflect on when we got into the point where the American president is seen as this global statesperson.
Well, when George Washington became president, it was a tiny little country, and many presidents after him were not global figures. Abraham Lincoln was known around the world a bit, but not until Woodrow Wilson showed up in Paris to negotiate the treaty that ended World War I did people realize how important the U.S. president was. He was met with crowds there that the kinds that Julius Caesar presumably got when he came back to Rome after conquering some country or some area. And at that point, Woodrow Wilson became the most important person, certainly in the Western world. Subsequent presidents became less important until FDR. And then after FDR, it became clear that the American president, certainly in the Western world and maybe in the entire world, is the most important person in the world at any given time. And it's just unusual how important what the president does affects everybody in the world. So everybody, when I go around the world, any country, it's small or big, people ask me all the time, what does the president think about this? What's going to happen in the U.S.? It's amazing how people follow what the president said. And I should say on the title, I have said tongue-in-cheek many times, the highest calling of mankind is private equity. And and I thought it really was. But when I analyzed it, I thought the presidency was probably a higher calling. And I should say the book is dedicated to two people. One is the person who hired me once to work in the White House, and that's Stuart Eisenstadt, who's right there, who was the domestic advisor for President Carter. And he and Doug and I are the only three people here wearing suits and ties, so shows you what generation we are. And the other one is Ted Sorensen, who was a great speechwriter and advisor to President Kennedy, and I had a chance to work with him when I graduated from law school. So those are the people that inspired me to work for a president and gave me a chance to do so, and that's who I dedicated the book to.
I think well, let's get to George Washington, because you deal with him early on. What do you want people to remember about Washington as president? We know the Revolutionary War hero, Valley Forge, Yorktown, but as our first president.
Well, he set the standards. Remember, he was creating a job from whole cloth. Nobody had ever been president before. And so he did things that we still live with. For example, many people said he should be called Your Excellency, Your Highness, so forth. He said, no, Mr. President. And after 200 years, we still use Mr. President. He didn't want it to be a regal position in the way that European royalty was. He wanted it to be more of an elected kind of position, and people would treat him like a normal human being. And he set many standards, and one of the most important standards he set was 2 terms. As you know better than I, he hated the job initially. He didn't want the job to begin with. No member of his family, no male member of his family ever lived past 50, and he was 57, I think, at the time that he became president. And so after a few months, he was frustrated because he had to deal with Congress, and Congress was turning down some of his appointments. He didn't like it. He was going to quit in the first couple months. Finally, he was persuaded to stay for the term, and then he didn't want to have a second term, and he had a farewell address written, I think, by Alexander Hamilton, and it was going to be given, but finally, or James Madison wrote it. Madison wrote it, and then he persuaded to serve a second term. But after the second term, he said, that's it. And that became the informal standard, which is you serve 2 terms and then you're gone. And ironically, when FDR became president for 4 terms, the Republicans were very upset. So they got a constitutional amendment through that said you're limited to 2 terms. It was in the Constitution then. And then they finally had somebody who could have served 3 terms, which is Dwight Eisenhower. So they got hung on their own petard a bit. But Washington set the standards for, I think, some humility, some, I would say, ability to deal appropriately with members of Congress. And, I think he also set a standard for integrity and that people looked up to him. People admired the President of the United States. He was somebody you could say to your children, this is the person you should follow as a role model. It was a standard that sometimes we haven't always had.
President Biden in Chicago gave what felt like a farewell address, but he's still our president. George Washington gave the farewell address everybody always reflects on. What was Washington's farewell address, and what's important for it in the 21st century?
Well, you've all probably heard of Washington's famous farewell address, and what it's most famous for is saying, be careful of foreign entanglements. But actually, Washington never actually gave that speech. He never gave the address. He basically was printed in a newspaper. It was written, initially, he had the address that was Madison had written. Then he asked Hamilton to write another one, and he kind of combined the two. And so it was written by two people that he admired for a while, but he never actually physically gave the farewell address.
And you talk in the book about how Thomas Jefferson could walk, he could walk down the streets of Washington by himself, just walk, say hello, enter office.
Right.
What was that climate like, let's say, around the Adams-Jefferson period?
Well, Jefferson liked to consider himself a common man. And although he loved great wine, he loved fancy food, he loved great things from France and other foreign countries, he considered himself a commoner. And so it wasn't with accident that he walked by himself from his boarding house to be inaugurated President of the United States. No entourage, no carriage or anything like that. And he gave that speech, and that was the last speech he gave in public. He had a high-pitched voice, and he didn't like to speak in public. And so while he gave his first inaugural address in public, he never again made another public speech. The way he would communicate is, in those days they called levees or parties at the White House. He didn't have a hostess because his wife had passed away. He often used Dolly Madison as a hostess, but he would have people there, and he would tell people what his thoughts were, and that was how people got to know what the president thought, was by these social occasions. And it was interesting that he, as eloquent a person as he was, and a person who could write the Declaration of Independence, didn't really feel comfortable making public speeches. And in fact, when he wrote the Declaration of Independence, and it was delivered to the Second Continental Congress to look at it, they made about 60 different changes in it. He never once spoke about any of the changes publicly or in the Continental Congress, because he just didn't like to speak in public, and he had a high-pitched voice, and I guess he was just somewhat shy about speaking in public. So all the changes that were made to the Declaration of Independence by the others in the Continental Congress, he never actually addressed them. Later, he wrote to friends, doing something like we might all do, or I would do, say, here's what they did to my draft. Don't you think my draft is better than what they did? And, but he didn't, he was so embarrassed with what they did, they called it, he mutilated his draft, that for about 9 years or so, he would never admit that he had written the Declaration of Independence. Later, interestingly, he had the most interesting epitaph of anybody. He had 3 things that he wanted on his tombstone. And they were, number 1, of course, was the author of the Declaration of Independence, but he didn't put in the 3 that he was President of the United States. Now, you would think being President of the United States would be the most significant thing he did, but it wasn't that big a deal to him compared to the other things he'd done, like creating the University of Virginia. And for some people, being the President of the United States is the highest thing they're ever going to do. But for a few people, particularly those who are in the military, the most important thing they did is probably win those wars. So Dwight Eisenhower, you could argue, the most important thing he did while he was a very good president for 8 years was D-Day and winning the war as Supreme Allied Commander. And the same with Ulysses S. Grant. He won the Civil War. His presidency was not so wonderful.
You include in there, David interviews some great historians and talks with them, Gordon Wood being one. In that particular chapter, you deal with Adams and Jefferson. Just to remind the audience, that 1800 election was really the beginning of our two-party system of today. The Democrat-Republican Party of Jefferson, the Federalist Party of Adams. Tell us why you decided to do a chapter on those two together.
They were 2 giants of the time. Adams was the person who was most responsible for the resolution to break away from England. He was the most responsible for it. He was pushing for it in the First and Second Continental Congress. And Jefferson was the intellectual giant in the time in many ways. He wrote the Declaration of Independence. And these were men who really got along quite well with each other when they were both in Europe at the same time. After the Revolutionary War started, negotiating treaties and so forth, they were social friends, they got along well, and so forth. But then, when they came back, there began to be a schism for probably 2 reasons. Number 1 was that Jefferson became a vice president under John Adams. And John Adams was elected president after Washington finished. His vice president was Jefferson. But then Jefferson had the temerity to run for president against Adams. So can you imagine a vice president actually running against his president? Well, maybe you can, but so Jefferson defeated Adams, and Adams had to leave town. And can you imagine, Adams didn't stay around for the inauguration of Jefferson. Can you imagine a president leaving office without seeing his successor inaugurated? Well, maybe you can. So, but another factor was this. Adams always thought the most important thing that happened in the Second Continental Congress was the resolution to break away from England, which occurred on July the 2nd. He wrote to his wife Abigail and said, for the next 1,000 years, this will be the most important day in American history. We'll celebrate it with fireworks and everything. But that was July the 2nd. So why do we celebrate July the 4th? Well, July the 4th was the date that the Declaration was agreed to, and Adams would say that was a nice propaganda document. It's a public relations statement, not as significant as the actual vote. But what happened on July the 3rd, 1777, they were in the Continental Congress, they were dealing with the war, they forgot to celebrate it. So they said, let's get organized. They finally took them 2 days to organize it, and so they did it on July the 4th. And so forever after, Jefferson and Adams sparred over what was more important. Adams resented the fact that it was the Declaration associated with Jefferson that got all the attention, and Jefferson thought that his document was the most important statement of what we did and why we got away from England, and he thought that it was the correct thing to celebrate the 4th of July. So they kind of had I would say they weren't talking for a long time. And then finally, toward the end of their life, Dr. Benjamin Rush got them together and brought them together. They exchanged maybe 50 letters or so toward the end of their life. Interestingly, as you probably all know, they died on the same day. And Adams, on his deathbed, said, Jefferson still lives. But actually, Jefferson had died a few hours earlier. And they both died on July the 4th, 1826, exactly 50 years to the day after they had signed the Declaration of Independence. And many people thought at the time that it was providential that these two great heroes of the Revolutionary War died on exactly the same day, July the 4th.
And they had an argument about the American Revolution, which comes out in their letters, which was that Adams believed the revolution started with the Boston Massacre, and Jefferson thought it was about Patrick Henry in Virginia. Right. And so they had a little bit of a feud. But what that correspondence, do you feel, David, that they did that for the country to show that even though you can be opponents in an election later, because Stuart Eisenstadt knows Jimmy Carter and Gerald Ford became close, Bill Clinton and George Herbert Walker Bush became close. Sometimes you think it's done to show unity.
I think they were mad at each other for a number of reasons and other personal things, and I guess they run against each other. And they had different philosophies. One was a Federalist, and one was what they then called a Republican. I think toward the end of their life, they recognized that their life wasn't going to be going on much longer, and so I thought they would reconcile a bit, and they did. And I think it was healthy for the country. What you allude to, though, is I do talk about in the book that former presidents of the United States have a lot of knowledge, and sometimes it might be helpful to the country if they got together and did things, if they can agree on things. So if you get all the former presidents of the United States to agree to something, it might be helpful to the current president of the United States, presumably if that person agrees with it as well. But we haven't really had our former presidents get along all that well. A couple have. Ford and Carter got along reasonably well. Bush and 41 and Clinton got along pretty well. I think, honestly, as long as President Trump is a former president, I doubt that they're all going to get together because I don't think the other presidents get along well with them. That'd be my guess.
Yes. I think that's true.
Right. So let me ask you a question for a moment. So I want to take advantage of the fact that Doug is here. Doug knows more about the presidency than I do, honestly, and he knows certainly more about what's going on in the campaign. So we're not watching CBS, where you're a consultant and you're on TV. So tell us, if you had to guess today, who do you think is going to be the next president of the United States?
I feel Kamala Harris has the momentum right now, and there are big markers coming, September 10th in particular, with that debate. But if she can have sustainable momentum, I think she's going to get it. I think they've opened up the Democratic tent more. But Trump is never to be underestimated. People thought that he was gone 2 times before, and he's still there. Some people thought after January 6th he wouldn't be able to do it. He has a ability to, he's a sustainable figure in American life. But what I saw in Chicago is that Harris has opened up the tent, brought in Republicans, and brought in young people that were, not into Biden at all. And there's now a kind of a beating heart to the Democratic Party. And I think activism, not just fundraising, but activism, young people don't want to do work for a year, but they might do it for 70 days. And so if they can keep it going in that kind of momentum, I think we might be looking at having our first woman president.
So let me ask you this. In the Constitutional Convention, in a special committee called the Committee on Unfinished Parts, they came up with the Electoral College. And James Wilson is supposedly the person who came up with the idea. If the Electoral College were not around, do you think campaigns would be run much differently? And do you think there's any chance the Electoral College ever will be abolished?
That's a big question and a good one. But I feel like Electoral College is here because it seems you'd have to get Congress and we'd have to undo everything. But if it was just popular vote, the problems would be people running for president would only focus where majority populations would be, meaning Los Angeles or New York or Chicago, offer them speed rail, offer them every bridge known to man, offer them anything where population centers are. And so rural America or small town America might be cut out in that shake. With that said, it would seem pure democracy would be who gets the most votes. So you're asking my heart, it would be wonderful if the Electoral College would go away, but I don't see that happening anytime soon. I think we're here with the Electoral College, and you got to play the game the way it is. It's been heartbreaking for Democrats because obviously Hillary Clinton had a lot more votes than Donald Trump, but she didn't win the Electoral College, or she would have been the first American president.
So interestingly, 5 times we've had a president of the United States who lost the popular vote but won the Electoral College vote. And very famously, George W. Bush won Florida by 539 votes or something like that. Had there not been a third-party candidate like Ralph Nader there or Pat Buchanan, probably Florida would have gone differently. But interestingly, the only time we really had a protest in this country, civil unrest, you could say, was when the person who got 7 million popular votes less than the other person was upset about it. You would think the person who lost the election getting 7 million votes more, but that was the other way around. Somebody got 7 million votes, popular votes less, and that was the person who was most upset. You would think it was kind of ass backwards.
Yeah. The thing, I think President Trump has pieced together a kind of coalition, but a part of it, his thinking is Roy Cohn and the great lawyer of McCarthy and Nixon and others, big influence on Roger Stone and others. And Trump's learned a kind of philosophy to never admit defeat. Right. So it's just, he will not admit he lost this election in my mind. If he loses, he will say it was rigged, no matter what, because that's part of this philosophy. And everybody could say, well, it's not true, and the courts don't say that, but he made some sort of deal that he sticks to that. And it brought him as far as he is to being the nominee of his party 3 times in a row, president of the United States, and a very powerful figure. So I don't see him abandoning that philosophy unless Harris really started winning winning North Carolina and Georgia and Michigan and Wisconsin, and it was a mini, and I stress mini, mandate for Harris.
You know many of the presidents, most recent presidents, since you've been doing this as a scholar in this. Who was the smartest president you ever met?
Jimmy Carter. In the sense, the Carter's integrity and when you talk to him, people would say he had an engineer's mind, Naval Academy, nuclear submarine mind, but he was really he had developed and ethics around himself. Now, he became president perhaps too early because he was one-term governor from Georgia, suddenly you're dumped in Washington. And he didn't do well with keeping the Ted Kennedy liberal wing of the Democratic Party happy, or the Scoop Jackson, moderate slash, military wing of the party. So he wasn't a great party leader, but as a person, when he turns 100 this October 1, and we look at things, and remember, politically, he got wiped out by Reagan. Terrible campaign in '80. But when you look at what he did, Camp David Peace Accord, Panama Canal treaties, recognizing People's Republic of China, saving all of the Alaska lands, denouncing apartheid, creating a Department of Energy, creating FEMA, promoting alternative fuels, I could go on. There's quite a record there. And when you have one-on-one with him, you realize he's now in hospice, but he used to be sharp as a tack.
Well, he's, I would say, from my experience, and Stuart knew him much better than I spent 4 years in the White House, very smart person, for sure, but his post-presidency will be probably a book you've written about, a subject you've written about. His 40 years, his presidency was only 4 years, so 10 times as long as former president. And during that period of time, his speaking fees for money were zero. I mean, he doesn't take any speaking fees. You ever heard of a president not taking speaking fees for speaking after being president? But he supported himself by writing, I think, 28 books since he left the presidency, and that's what he really did. And married 75 years, I think it was 75 years. Anybody here imagined being married 75 years? Long time.
And then, of course, Bill Clinton reads American history like it's nobody's business. He reads all the books, and Barack Obama's an intellectual president, and I've gotten to talk to them in a different way. I mean, those are three very bright. We're with a book audience. If you want a bookish president, Obama, Clinton, and Jimmy Carter loved reading, and they would be very comfortable with his audience.
Right. So on the presidency,
he's turned the interview on me, I think.
Well, you know a lot more about it. So I would say, one of the problems we have with the presidency is the way you get to be elected president today is you spend roughly 2 years of your life campaigning for it. So many people who are very talented, people run foundations, run corporations, they run educational institutions of one type or another, universities. None of these people say, I don't want to spend 2 years of my life begging for money and basically, eating bad food and not getting enough sleep. It's a shame because our campaigns are 2 years long. In many countries, in Western democracies, the campaigns can be 1 or 2 weeks. And so we have a process that's kind of filters out a lot of people who are actually pretty talented and they just don't want to run for president. Think about this. In the year let's say in the beginning of our country's history, 1776, we had roughly 3 million people in the country, 3 million people. 500,000 of those were slaves, and they couldn't be in government. We had 1.25 million women, and they weren't allowed to be in government. We had 10,000 people who were Jewish, they couldn't be in government or vote. And then we had about 500,000 white Christian non-property owning men, and they weren't allowed to be in government because they didn't own any property. So the only people who could be in government were roughly 400 to 450,000 people who were white Christian property owning men. And out of that, we got George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, James Madison. Now we have 330 million people. Yeah. And, we have sometimes people say, where's the George Washingtons? Where are the other people? Well, my theory is they all went into private equity.
And so many of our presidents had a military record.
That's true.
Not just the Grant, who you mentioned, and you talked around Chernow, but somebody like Theodore Roosevelt wanted to be called the Colonel because of his service in the Spanish-American War. Over president, you have to call him Colonel Roosevelt. And John F. Kennedy meant on his Oval Office, the PT 109, and he'd hand out buttons. But Bill Clinton didn't do military service. And then by 72, the Vietnam War, we didn't do conscription. Do you think we've lost something? Because in the military, you can sometimes find leadership through, in a true...
It's changed. I thought in the 1960s or so, you couldn't be president of the United States or run for president if you hadn't served in the military. And all the people that served more or less in the 60s and 70s, pretty much up until the Vietnam War came along, you all had people who had military backgrounds of some type. It was a mark you had to have. Now, it's not required. And if anything, in some cases, if you served in certain wars, maybe the Vietnam War was very unpopular, you didn't get a lot of credit for serving in there. So I think now people who want to run for president don't feel they have to have a military record. Though if you do have one, they will willing to advertise it. So Governor Walz is obviously talking about his military record, and J.D. Vance is obviously talking about his military record. So I think if you have it, it's fine. But if you don't have it, I don't think it's required so much anymore.
You know, everybody's favorite president, I mean, all presidents' favorite or most favorite president is Lincoln. Obama sort of launched himself in Springfield and Lincoln-esque in Illinois, and George W. Bush said his favorite president is Lincoln. You talk with historian Ted Widmer, have a chapter about Lincoln. What is it that you think the American public should understand about our 16th president?
Lincoln was a person who would not probably be elected president today, of course. He was ungainly tall in some ways. He was not very well coordinated. There is a theory that he had Marfan's disease, but I don't know if that's true or not. But that he was unusually tall, that he was gangly, uncoordinated, not very handsome. As one person once accused him of being two-faced, he said, well, if I had two faces, why would I wear this one? And a young girl persuaded him to grow a beard. In fact, he met this young girl as he was going to Washington to be inaugurated, and it was her idea in a letter that she had sent him, thinking he would look better with a beard. Lincoln is by far the greatest president we ever had, and the reason is he did something that not every person in the United States would have done. In fact, very few would have done. He kept the Union together. Because at the time when the South was breaking away and some of the states seceded before he became president, many people in the North, they said, look, let the South go. We don't have to worry about them. We'll have our own country. And it was Lincoln that said, no, the Constitution really allows slavery in the South. I'm not going to get rid of slavery. They shouldn't break away, and I'm going to hold the Union together. And we went through the Civil War. We lost 3% of our population, roughly 750,000 men and women in military combat and other deaths that occurred. But he prevailed, and then ultimately he issued the Emancipation Proclamation, which was issued as a war device. It was a device to maybe help get more African-American freed slaves to serve in the military, but also as a way to kind of show the South that we were going to end slavery, and he was not willing to go back on that. Ultimately, we needed the 13th Amendment to truly end it. But by ending slavery and by holding the Union together and by doing it with humility, can you imagine Abraham Lincoln walking around the White House saying, you know, I won the Civil War by myself. I pretty much did it by myself. You can't see him doing that because he had humility. And despite the fact he didn't have an education, he really was not educated. He wrote the two greatest, I think, speeches in American history, the second, two of the three best maybe, the second inaugural address and the Gettysburg Address. And in those 272 words of the Gettysburg Address, he captured everything that America is all about. And nobody's written 272 words or even 2,272 words better that describes what America is all about than he did in that. And so I think he deserves enormous amount of credit. He was assassinated not very far from here at Ford's Theater because when this country was created, George Washington wanted to have a national cultural center. And it wasn't created because we ran out of money. But Washington thought the best way to honor people was to give them a gift to a theater or a show or an opera. He loved doing that because he loved shows, he loved opera, and so forth. And so he wanted to have a national cultural center. He asked Père L'Enfant to draft it up in the plans of Washington, but Père L'Enfant got fired later for some other reasons. And then we had entrepreneurs building theaters, not the government. And the most famous entrepreneur was Mr. Ford, and he created Ford's Theater. And that's obviously a tragic situation. And it could have been prevented, most likely. Never know how history would have been different, but what happened was on the night that Lincoln was going to go to see our American cousin in Ford's Theater, he invited Ulysses S. Grant and his wife Julia to come with him. Julia Grant had seen Mrs. Lincoln yell at somebody else a couple days earlier when they were together in Virginia, and she said, I don't want to be around that woman, so they created an excuse not to be there. I don't know if anybody's ever created an excuse not to go to something you didn't want to go to, but the excuse was we have to visit our children in New Jersey. So they got on a train, they went to New Jersey. Had Ulysses S. Grant, with all the military entourage he had around him, been at Ford's Theater that night, it's unlikely John Wilkes Booth could have just slipped in and shot Lincoln, but you never know.
In our remaining time, I'm going to talk about two lesser talked about presidents and get your take. I know what it is from the book, but for the audience, he talked to Amity Sales about Calvin Coolidge, who used to be just almost a throwaway line, but there's been a bit of a revision about Coolidge. What's your take on him?
Well, when Reagan became president, he got a portrait of Coolidge and put it in the cabinet room. And people said, Coolidge, well, why Coolidge? Coolidge was a person who was elected governor of Massachusetts, and then as governor, he famously broke a police strike. That made him so well known that he became vice president candidate under Harding. They got elected. Harding died of a heart attack. Coolidge became president, and then he was reelected, and then he chose not to run again. But he was famous for actually doing something very unusual. He really wanted to balance the budget. Remember that? That's when you have more money coming in than you have money going out. So he wanted to balance the budget. He was in favor of tax cuts for wealthy as well as non-wealthy people. But he had an unusual habit for a president of the United States. He didn't like to talk very much. He was very laconic. And famously, a woman went to him once and said, I have a bet that I can get you to say more than 2 words. And he said, you lose. He just didn't like to talk. He didn't like to brag about himself. He came from a New England background, flinty background, didn't want to spend money, didn't brag about himself. And I think some of the things that he stood for, balancing the budget, fiscal conservatism, not having an expansive federal government, was the things that made some Republicans really like him.
What about Gerald Ford? It's going to be the 50th anniversary of Nixon's pardoning of Ford this September 8th, 50 years.
Right.
What was Richard Norton Smith, you talked to, a great Ford biographer, how should history look at Ford? Is he an accidental president or something more than that?
Ford became president because my former governor from Maryland had to step down because of a bribery scandal, Spiro T. Agnew. And so Nixon wanted to appoint John Connally as vice president. Remember, under the 25th Amendment, a president could appoint a person to be vice president, and the person had to be confirmed by both the House and the Senate. He wanted Connally because he really admired Connally. Connally was everything Nixon wasn't: strong, self-assured, handsome, tall, charming, everything that Nixon wanted to be but wasn't quite. And he also thought that Connally could win the '76 election. But the Democrats said, we're not going to confirm him because why do we want to help somebody become the candidate in '76? So Connally couldn't get confirmed. So they had to get somebody who could be confirmed. And the idea was that Ford, who was going to retire from politics, everybody thought, and he pretty much said that, he would be confirmable because everybody liked him. But Nixon thought he wasn't so smart, and as a result, nobody would think he could possibly be president of the United States. So nobody would kick Nixon out of the office of president because who would want Ford to be president? That calculation was wrong. But Ford was a decent man, humble, didn't have aspirations to be a great global figure. But in the short time he was president, he did some pretty impressive things. He lost the debate to Jimmy Carter because he said in an artful way that Russia was not dominating Poland. That was a mistake. But I think the pardon was probably the principal problem he had. The pardon was done in August of '74, I believe it was, and he basically thought it was the best thing to do to get the country, get the pardon behind it. Nixon didn't really quite accept the idea he committed crime, and I think the country never quite forgave Ford for that. And the election was very close. And if a couple of votes had changed in 3 different states in that election in '76, Carter would have lost, Ford would have won. So I think Ford, though, to his credit, never once said he regretted pardoning Nixon, and it did set the issue behind him. But he never said, well, geez, I wish I hadn't done that. I would have been president again. He never said that. And I think he deserves a lot of credit for it. And he received the Profiles in Courage Award from the Kennedy Library in part because of that. So I think he deserves a great deal of credit for doing that.
You work with PBS a lot, you do interviews a lot. Has television changed presidential politics? Or let's say since John F. Kennedy and Nixon did their 4 debates in '60 and Kennedy invented the press conference, do you have to be telegenic to rise?
It certainly helps. People forget this, but when John Kennedy did his press conference, they were every other week, I think they were done at the auditorium at the State Department. That was novel because you had a president actually answering questions in a very visible way that hadn't been done before. Before that, presidents had given interviews, but it wasn't televised in a live way, typically. Very rarely did Eisenhower kind of answer questions in a public way. And then when Kennedy did the debates with Nixon, that was novel. Remember, there had never been presidential debates before, never. The famous Lincoln-Douglas debates were for the Senate race in Illinois. They were not presidential debates. So when they had 4 debates, it gave everybody an opportunity to see what these candidates are like. And famously, it is said, I don't know, you might have a view on this, that Kennedy won the first debate because he looked more polished, he looked more assured, he was tan and so forth, and Nixon was sweating and our eyes were darting around. People who watched it, who listened to it on radio, thought that Nixon had won. So you think it made a big difference whether you watch on TV or listen on radio in terms of how you voted then?
I do, and although both were very good in '60, Nixon and Kennedy, but Walter Cronkite, I wrote a biography of him, and he taught a class in 1952 when TV cameras were brought into the convention. Walter had very little money, and so he made some side dough showing how to apply makeup for a camera and how to talk into a TV. And the people took his seminar class. Kennedy took his class of Cronkite. Sam Rayburn took it. Guess who didn't? Nixon.
Wow. And right before the debate, Nixon's people asked Kennedy whether they're going to have makeup or something, and Kennedy said, no, he's not going to have makeup. He did have makeup, and Nixon really didn't, and he was sweating. It didn't look very good. Think about this. In those days, the news, if you were in Washington, D.C., you paid attention to what was in the Washington Post the next morning and the New York Times the next morning, and the evening news was 15 minutes. That's it. CBS, NBC, ABC, 15 minutes, not 30 minutes. There was no cable news. There was no social media. There was nothing. And so you only played to a limited audience then. Today, if you don't have media skills, social media skills, I think you're in trouble. You may be terrible on television, but if you have somebody good to work your social media, you can probably be okay.
You know, David, you've known really so many of our recent presidents. So in closing, let me ask you, and why don't we just go to be spirited, the good qualities, what made them rise to the top of the mountain? George W. Bush, what is it about Bush that was able to win 2 terms?
The right name, I think was helpful. George W. Bush, I know reasonably well. He's pretty smart compared to what people might think. He actually does love reading books. He's an incredible reader of books, as you probably know. He had this great name, and the Bush name was pretty valuable. And, you know, some people would say what I'm going to say is maybe apocryphal, but I think there's some truth to it. After George W. Bush was elected governor a second term, for the second time, all of a sudden people said, who should be the Republican nominee for president? And there were pollings of Republican voters, and overwhelmingly, George W. Bush was the favorite of people who were Republicans. Why would that be? Because the governor of Texas has very little authority. Most of the authority is in the lieutenant governor. And the legislature in Texas meets only every other, I think it's only 2 months every other year. So it doesn't do that much. So why would somebody, having served 1 term as governor of Texas, all of a sudden be the favorite candidate? Well, obviously he had the father who was president of the United States, and that was the factor. See, when people were asked, Republicans, who would you like to see as the next president of the United States, overwhelmingly it was named George Bush. And then when you read the internals of the polling data, it showed that about 2/3 of those people thought they were selecting the father. They were asking for the father to run again. So I'll end with one thing about George W. Bush. I asked George Herbert Walker Bush once, and he was associated with my firm for a while, how come you didn't name your son George Herbert Walker Bush Jr.? Why is he W? Why did you forget the H? And he said, well, when I was a little boy growing up in Greenwich, I had these 2 middle names, Herbert Walker Bush, and people made fun of me. And I swore I would never do that to my son. So I gave him 1 middle name, not 2. And that's why there's no George Herbert Walker Bush Jr.
Well,
more than you want to know.
No, my last one and then let's call it, we will have to end the session. Our current president, Joe Biden, sort of doing his goodbye. How do you see history will look at Biden, and what's been his strengths in his long political career?
Some people in your profession say it takes about 40 years after a president's out of office before you really know. You've seen all the documents and so forth. But I think it will depend on what happens in the election. Yeah. If the Vice President of the United States is elected, then he will be seen as somebody who gave away the opportunity to run again. Even though he may have had a lot of opposition in the party, he probably would have been the nominee again. Maybe he wouldn't have been elected again, but he now is seen as having sacrificed his own ambitions, and if she gets elected, he will be remembered not only for the infrastructure bill and for things he did to help Ukraine, and not only for the chip bill and other kinds of things, and getting the economy out of COVID and getting the economy back in a reasonable place and creating a lot of jobs. He'll remember less for that than the fact that he was willing to step back and say, I want my vice president to have a chance to run because she might have a better chance of getting elected. If she loses, then I think his reputation won't be quite as good.
Thank you so much. David Rubenstein is the best.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Dave.